A single letter, sealed and forgotten, sitting in a dusty archive for 300 years, and when someone finally opened it, it rewrote everything historians thought they knew. This happens more often than you think. There's a particular kind of shock that comes not from discovering something new, but from realizing the old version was wrong. That's what happened in 1952 when a researcher in the Vatican's secret archives pulled out a bundle of correspondence that had been misfiled, quietly buried under centuries of bureaucratic error, since the 1580s. The letters were from Mary, Queen of Scots, written in cipher, and they changed the entire picture of her final years. For generations, the accepted story was that Mary went to her execution in 1587 largely resigned, perhaps even cooperative with her fate. A tragic queen, betrayed, but passive. These letters told something different. They showed a woman actively negotiating with foreign courts, coordinating with Catholic powers on the continent, and most startlingly, making specific requests about where her body should be buried and what should happen to her son James. She wasn't resigned. She was maneuvering right up to the end. The letters had been captured by Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, decoded, and then, instead of being destroyed or used as evidence, simply filed incorrectly. A clerical error. The most consequential clerical error in British royal history. When scholars finally decoded the full set using modern cryptographic methods in the early 2000s, the picture sharpened further. Mary had been in contact with at least 3 separate foreign powers simultaneously. She understood exactly what was being done to her, and she was trying, right to the last possible moment, to shape what came after. The historical image of a passive martyr dissolved. What replaced it was something considerably more interesting. A strategist who never stopped playing the game, even when the game was already lost. This is what lost letters do. They don't just add detail. They reframe the entire narrative, the motivations, the character, the meaning of events that everyone thought were already settled. In 1914, in the days immediately following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were exchanging telegrams. That part is well known. The two cousins, both monarchs of empires about to go to war, calling each other Willie and Nicky, desperately trying to find a way out. What is far less known is the letter, not a telegram, an actual handwritten letter, that Nicholas sent on July 29th, which was intercepted by German military intelligence, held, and never delivered. The letter proposed a direct personal summit, not a diplomatic conference. The two of them, alone, meeting in person to negotiate the crisis before mobilization became irreversible. German military high command decided the letter was dangerous, not because it would fail, but because it might succeed. A personal meeting between the two emperors, happening quickly enough, could have interrupted the mobilization timetable that Helmuth von Moltke, the younger, had spent years constructing. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's entire military strategy, depended on speed. A summit would introduce delay. Delay would wreck the plan. So the letter was held, filed, marked as received but not yet transmitted. And by the time Nicholas realized his letter had never arrived, mobilization had passed the point of no return. The letter surfaced in 1961 in a review of captured German military archives. Historians have argued ever since about whether the summit could have actually stopped the war. The honest answer is, probably not, given how many other forces were in motion. But it might have delayed it by weeks. And a delay of weeks in the summer of 1914 might have been enough for cooler heads to find a different path. The letter sat in a folder for 47 years. One intercepted piece of paper. And the question it raises is not just historical, it's structural. How many other moments like this exist, buried in archives we haven't fully reviewed? Christopher Columbus wrote a lot of letters. The ones that survived, and were published, made him famous across Europe almost immediately after 1492. His account of the voyage, his descriptions of the islands, and the people he encountered, spread rapidly. He became a hero of exploration. The letters he wrote privately told a different story. For centuries, a collection of Columbus's personal correspondence, letters to the Spanish crown that were not meant for public circulation, sat in the archive of the Indies in Seville. They were technically accessible, but rarely studied in full, partly because the handwriting is genuinely difficult and partly because historians had already formed their conclusions. When a team of researchers undertook a full systematic review in the 1980s and 1990s, what they found complicated the heroic narrative considerably. Columbus knew, relatively early, that what he had found was not Asia. He had enough information from indigenous people, from the geography, from the scale of the landmass he was encountering, to understand he was somewhere previously unknown to European maps. But he kept writing to Ferdinand and Isabella claiming otherwise. Not out of confusion. Out of calculation. His entire financial arrangement with the Spanish crown, his titles, his percentage of trade revenues, his governorship, was based on the promise of a western route to Asia. Admitting he had found something else entirely would have voided the contract. So he maintained the fiction. Privately, he seemed to understand the reality. Publicly, in every official document and published letter, he insisted until his death that he had reached the outer islands of Asia. The private letters didn't destroy Columbus's historical significance. He still made the crossing. The consequences were still enormous. But they replaced the myth of the visionary explorer with something more human and considerably more complicated. A man who was in over his head financially, managing a lie, and hoping the geography would eventually cooperate with his story. There's a pattern in all of these stories. The letters weren't truly lost in most cases. They were misplaced, misfiled, suppressed, or simply never studied carefully enough. They were sitting in archives that existed and were nominally open, waiting for someone to actually look. The question is why they keep surfacing now, after so long. Part of the answer is digitization. When you photograph and index an entire archive, things that were practically invisible, buried in folders nobody thought to cross-reference, become searchable. A researcher in Tokyo can now examine a misfiled document in Seville without booking a flight. The geography of scholarship has collapsed. Part of it is interdisciplinary tools. The Mary Queen of Scots letters were cracked not by historians alone, but by cryptographers applying modern computational methods to historical ciphers. Columbus's correspondence benefited from linguists who specialized in 15th century Castilian handwriting. New specializations are finding things old ones missed. And part of it, the uncomfortable part, is that previous generations of historians sometimes didn't look because they didn't want to find anything that disrupted a settled narrative. Not always consciously. But there's a well-documented tendency to stop searching once you have a story that works. The archive is large. The career is finite. And revisionism is professionally risky. What all three of these stories share is a person whose real motives were more complex than the public records showed. Mary calculating her legacy, Nicholas reaching across a chasm, Columbus managing a financial disaster with geographical spin. In each case, the letter that survived official history was the performative one. The authentic one was buried. There are almost certainly others, sitting right now in folders that have been cataloged but not read, in basements of institutions that have been given funding to preserve but not to research. The history we have is the history of letters that made it through. The history that got suppressed is still out there, waiting for someone curious enough to go look. If you found this interesting, there's more where that came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you know of a lost document story we haven't covered, drop it in the comments. Genuinely curious what you got.